Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Legion 99 podcast, your source for the latest tactics, news, battle reports, hobby talk, and general Legion chatter.
All right, and welcome back, everybody, to the Legion 99 podcast. My name is Mike. I'm here today with Pat and Rich, two of my good friends who are helping me out lately. How you guys doing today?
Doing great, doing great.
I'd say good's an exaggeration, but we are friends. So. nice to see you guys and be in separate beds today. So that's good.
Yes. It's a
lonely world for you boys, huh?
It's a deep cut. But yeah, so we're back. We're going to talk a little bit more focused today than some of the previous episodes. We're going to talk a little bit about what exactly is a meta when it comes to something like competitive gaming. We'll talk about what you would expect to actually see at a competitive event. You know, obviously we're shifting into Worlds starting in about a week and a half. So people are starting to play some of their final warm-up tournaments, nail down those final details, and we'll go over some of that a little bit. Some feedback we've gotten lately is that everybody has been talking that like, oh, clones are the bad guys, but then no one actually talks about the counters to them. We just talk about the new Ewok lists, and it can be a little confusing. So we're going to talk about actual clone counters today, and do they work? You know, all of us have played a lot of clones recently. We've played both with and against them, so we'll give some firsthand knowledge there. And then we're going to talk a little bit about lists that we've been playing recently, getting set for Worlds ourselves, and some of the Dark Horse lists that we expect to see do pretty well in Adepticon. And then depending on the time, we might wrap up one of our best worst segments. We'll see how that goes here today. But Rich, I think this was mostly your idea to start with here. Do you want to talk first what you think the definition of a meta is, or what you're actually talking about when we say that about a competitive game?
Yeah, so a meta is what are the set of lists that you should expect to see that are competitively viable at your higher end events. Obviously, there are local metas that you might see in your local stores or your local game tournaments. But as you get wider and higher up in the tournament structure, what are you seeing on a regular basis? What is going to do well? What is probably going to make a top 8 cut?
Yeah, and I think it's what makes a top 8 cut consistently. You know, we're not talking about, one LVO tournament, just as a recent example, where a list does well, places top 4. Like, just because it shows up there does not mean it's a meta list. But if we're talking about 4 or 5 larger 60-person tournaments in a row and you see that list there, that's what we're talking about as a consistent finalist. For those of you who aren't fully aware as well, meta does stand for most efficient tactic available. So technically it can be watered down to what's the best thing that I can play. And one of the things that Legion has is it arguably has a very, very wide meta. And we may have
I'm
lost
still here.
Rich.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
So yeah, one of the things that I also think you should consider while thinking of meta is lists that can hard counter what you are trying to do that are going to regularly appear as well. Because, for instance, we haven't seen Tempest Force really have a breakout hit in the top 8 of tournaments. However, I would say that you still need to be aware that people are going to play those kinds of lists because they appeal to a type of gamer that most competitive games have. And so for a Tempest Force, if you don't have something that can handle what they do, you're gonna be screwed. So it is in the meta, even though it hasn't necessarily climbed to the top of the meta.
So does that make it part of the meta, or does that just mean that it's something like a skew or a counter list that you should be aware of? Because I do think there's a difference when you're planning for an event.
I think that's a good question. So I said to you the other day that I think the current meta is wider and deeper than people think. And when I say it's wider, I think that it stretches out further than people are seeing that can be competitive. It can be viably competitive in the meta. Tempest Force would be one of those. And deeper as in the list variety that you can see within a faction are further expanded than you could possibly think in variations. So like in the time that you and I have been talking about Yoda and clones. We've made a variation of that same list with Yoda in arcs or Yoda in phase twos and every combination possible that I think are all competitively viable and have a chance to pull the top 8 if they were playing by a good pilot.
How do you feel about that?
I think there's definitely a lot of I'll take it here, a lack of creativity and a lot of list building in Legion because somebody sees people are doing well with stuff and they just run with it. I do think ignoring the elephant in the room would be a little ridiculous because clones are really good right now. So everybody's like, that is the main meta. Things that maybe do well, as we'll try and get into later, are also going to be meta because this is the main thing. You're going to need something to attack the biggest, threat out there. And there's going to be a lot of them. So I think the points are pretty good. But I think, especially with the new units coming out, it's going to shift pretty quickly, maybe, because we don't know exactly how all these new units are going to interact with each other. So I'm actually excited for that. But yeah, I think spot on. There's going to be, there's an extensive way in Legion of things that counter each other somewhat well that you have to think about all these options. And you don't want to have the master of none good at everything type of list because you're just going to get beat by a lot of really good stuff. So you just kind of have to pick one matchup that you're just going to suck it up and lose, or at least be in a non-favorable position going into that.
Right, like you might start at like a 30-70 win percentage at something like that. If you're talking about like a clone ball versus a bombing run skew, you can win it because you can just kill everything that they have, but it's going to be pretty difficult to actually make that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kind of agree that I do think there's a lot of different lists that can compete, are competitive, but I slightly disagree in that Legion has a very wide meta because I think I'll still be pedantic and say there's probably 2 or 3 top lists, but like you said, there's not a lot of creativity at them. I shouldn't say that. There can be a lack of creativity at the moment when it comes to Legion list building, and the sample size for games that people play for Legion is honestly very tiny. We really don't play a lot of games, and even if you're talking about playing, like, oh, I played like 10 to 15 reps with my list, that's a lot. It's really not that many.
Not coming to Europe, at least.
it's a small sample size, and it's a sample size that includes dice variance, and like that's a major factor. It's not like you're playing a card game and you're going to go run 8 games against a gauntlet of lists in a day, and then the next day I'm going to go back and do another 8, and now I've played 16 in a week and I'm playing 50 a month. I might be playing 10 to 15 over 3 months with Legion. Just the amount of reps that you get is a little bit different just due to the time length of the game.
And those 10 to 15 could be very different skill gap in players, different quality of lists. Like you can test it against a bunch of different stuff or a bunch of different people. But let's be honest, if it's one of the top tier players in the world and they're playing an average player, I don't think it's going to matter too much. You're not going to get a lot of data from that. So it's good that they seem to be practicing against each other for everybody but us. But yeah, I don't. But to your point, you don't get enough data in a 3-hour game because there's not enough time for a ton of games, unfortunately.
And a little bit of a side note, but a skill that a lot of players take some time to develop that's just, I'll say, a little bit unique to Legion and maybe dice games in general, is that if you're playing a testing game and somebody has, let's say, a turn 2 roll that they go 11 for 11 on a die rollout on B1s, and you just wipe your hero, sometimes you have to walk that back and say, okay, statistically he should have taken 2 wounds here. Let's bump it up to 3, maybe 4, because it's a bad roll, and just kind of re-rack it, because you don't want to waste your data points, especially if you've invested all this time to get it set up. And I think even that can skew lists where it comes into, oh, well, I played this clone ball that just ran into Tempest Force and I rolled 6 crits and I killed the ATST in a turn. I didn't really have impact. I don't need it. And that's not a good data point, but sometimes that gets taken into account.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, knowing when to reset your table or your round while trying things out is definitely a skill to learn while practicing. Because you like Mike said, realistically, us here in the United States, we're not getting as many games as they are out in Europe, where they're playing every weekend, every minute. It seems like they got another tournament going that's 50 to 60 people, and they're getting a lot of good games in. Uh, Usually, if you're getting one in a week, you're feeling pretty good, right?
Yeah, I feel good about like one every other week right now. But
Yeah.
shifting gears just a little bit, but staying within this general umbrella. If we've kind of defined what a meta is in loose terms, let's kind of talk about some of the lists that you'd expect to see at a competitive event. If you're going to an Adepticon warm-up event, if you're going to the last chance qualifier, like Rich, what are you looking for and potentially not trying to counter, but being able to have an answer for in your own list?
Well, we all know that clones are the bad guys right now. We're all in a clone meta, and so you want to have a way to, if you're playing clones yourself, like I usually do, you're looking to make sure that uh, you're able to handle the things that clones really do well. Getting a lot of tokens, getting a lot of uh, shots over cover, getting a lot of shots through dodges. These are things that clone squads can do pretty nastily. Um, you're also looking to see, what could I do poorly against? So Rebel long range guns right now are pretty popular. I think overall, the Ewok list, the Wookiee list, uh, maybe even Geospam are all going to be really uh, hard for clones to deal with because they do specific things in overwhelming fashion. Uh, and those are the things that I would expect to see. I also feel like uh, Empire has some unexplored territory that you should be aware of. Blizzard is not dead. Tempest is somehow still alive. Uh, and, you know, Dark Troopers, they're scary still. They're real scary. They can do some scary things.
Yeah, I think kind of boiling down what you said there, there's like three main archetypes I kind of heard repeating there. I should say four. So obviously you've got your clone ball. You mentioned things like um, sorry, Tempest and Remnant, and both of those are armor. We're talking Dark Troopers, you're talking ATSTs. You will see the occasional clone saber tank list, as I saw at PAX a few times. You'll see long range gun lines. If you're talking Cassian, you're talking Ahsoka support for Cassian, the FD turrets. Those are still really effective, and they've kind of faded in popularity at the moment. But I'd be shocked if you didn't see a fair number of them show back up for Chicago. And then you're also talking horde armies or horde/melee SKUs. You're talking your Ewoks, your Wookiees, depending on how you want to classify the Geonosians. I think they're a little more like a flank, but that would be more of like a speeder bike stylist with the Geonosians. But there's a number of different archetypes you have to be prepped for. And going off of, let's kind of talk about some of the like skirmisher style lists then. Uh, Arguably the two biggest ones that we have would be the newfangled Geonosian lists, and then we also still have things like Blizzard that have them as speeder bikes. Pat, do you want to talk a little bit about how do you think the Geonosians might fare in the upcoming tournaments? Kind of more of that skirmish hit and run style.
I think if their dice are hot, they're going to be terrifying on a good table because the 9 cover, or even I guess if you have a couple of rough saves with as a clone player, your red dice. I mean, that's what you don't rely on your dice, but you need them to not necessarily completely fail you as you run low model armies. And I think if the Geos get some big rolls and you have a couple of whiffs, you're in trouble quick because they're gonna have a lot of bodies. They're denying your cover if they're played right, it seems. And honestly, I think there's gonna be a lot of interesting lists with the Geos, and I'm excited as a big Star Wars fan. It's nice to see them on the table. Slightly terrifying because I have no idea what they're gonna do to my army. But I think once they start losing guys, though, they're gonna get cooked because saving like Ewoks, right? Yeah. non-surging white saves.
They do have the surge, but they don't have any
They do
defensive tech.
surge. Okay.
There's no cover, low profile, or agile, anything like that.
That the Jay Schlansky appeared in the podcast. I like I do have to say that I like the geos, not for getting shots off, not for actually doing damage to other people. I think as a harasser, as a I'm going to hit the side of your army, I'm going to hit a weak spot uh, in the same fashion that Maul used to, that Bulba used to, because of that triple move. They really do zip. They zip all over that board, and they can do some really neat geo style tricks that Maul has done, but in a mass fashion, because you're now seeing it on 1 to 4 or 5 units.
Yeah, they really, I think lists like that really stress your ability to position. Um, Something that doesn't get talked about enough is how do you break down a table when you step up to it, and like where do you actually want to put your army? And when you're talking about playing like Blizzard Force against the Geonosians, I think that's where your setup comes in. Knowing where they're coming from, knowing how quickly they can get from point A to point B to C, and then therefore where you place your own objectives like your evaporators or your boxes or what angles you take for breakthrough really come into play.
Yeah, I was gonna add their objective play is terrifying. With those extra moves, I mean, even like a late play triple move onto your thing, you have one guy on. Like you have to be ready for everything. To your point of, you need to be positioned perfectly, especially if you're getting out activated. Like I'm sure they're gonna be able to do for you.
Yeah, I actually just played against them like 3 hours ago today. I played a test game with Nick, and he was running some Geonosian spam for me, and we played KP, which I thought would be really easy as a clone player there. Until I realized that it's really hard to get away from them just triple moving turn 6 to score, and they don't really need to get anywhere near the middle, to contest that point because they can just essentially stay at range 3 of the middle and then they move in and score. So had to play a pretty aggro game to force them off of that. But I figured as soon as I banned away boxes and breakthrough, I was like, oh, I'm fine. I've got key positions. I don't have to move. And then I realized I still have to chase them down.
Or that they can suddenly appear on what you thought was your safe KP, because wow, 3 speed 2 moves is a lot.
Yeah, I actually ended up putting my KP, not to battle report too much, but putting my KP pretty close to the middle, about as close as I could. It was like 6.5 inches away, just so that I had the ability to shift my guys back if they suddenly flooded towards the home point. I didn't know if that was going to bite me too much with them being too close to it, but I didn't want to have to, leave 2 of my 8 activations at home to deal with it.
Yeah, seems like a double-edged sword there. Because when you first said it, I was like, is he saying this is a mistake to leave it that close because they can get to it that much easier? I guess it depends on deployment and a lot of other things. Because, like you said, you don't want to waste too many units. Safe, keeping your safe one safe, which it should be in basically every matchup, but it seems like it might not be. Or do you just make them try to go after that and just smoke them when they do?
I think that's a good way to segue into the how do you counter clones, uh, because one of the ways that you do counter clones is by being mobile, uh, using maneuverability to counter their ability to just ball up, making it so that they have to fight on multiple friends, or you have to move at a moment's notice can take away their tokens, and if you take away their tokens, you have a little bit of a better ability to crack into them.
Yeah, movement is a really good way to put it. Your average clone list right now is 8 to 9 activations. 2 of those 8 are single model, which usually are Jedi or Padme lists, and another one tends to be an Echo Strike. So it's another one that doesn't have a great deal of wound capability. You can't really hang it off by itself. So you have to really, I shouldn't say have to. One of the things that you can do is you can really spread it out and you can try to pull the clones apart to another side. My follow-up question to that would be for both of you guys as clone players, does that actually work? Or is it a little bit more of a paper strategy? Because I don't know if that answer is crystal clear, as a blanket statement.
I think it's easier to deal with arcs because they get that semi-free action. Their shots hit a lot harder. They're probably still getting the lethal off because they get named for moving. So if you don't have them in your list, you probably should. Especially with Geos trying to make you run around the map here, you're gonna want fast units that can keep up. But I think it's very objective dependent and deployment dependent on what they're able to force you to do. So I think I'm gonna hate myself for saying this. When you're playing a clone person, you have to force one or the other to be terrible for them. And if you're not gonna have a good time probably because I mean they're the army that's supposed to be elite at small numbers, and they are. They might need a tweak, but like you need to force them to do the things they don't want to do. I
Sure.
don't think it works the greatest, but there are definitely plays to be made where you're forcing them to do things they don't want to do, and you're going to win the game because of it.
You need to leverage that bid that your list should be having if it is not the fist, the hammer, whatever you want to call it. Because if you have a bid, you're bidding to have that objective, you're bidding to have that deployment and conditions, and you definitely want to make sure that your battle deck reflects the objectives that clones are not great at. You know, the breakthroughs, the bombing runs. Uh, I don't think you should take payload, but maybe sabotage if you're playing the geos. Depending on what your list is, you definitely want to take the right objective for it to be able to outmaneuver them into having to play a game on a different front than they want to.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned bid because I think when it comes to a movement based list, there's two things that actually make it effective, and that's activation count and bid. If you're playing something like a Blizzard Force at 800 points, clone player doesn't feel terrible. You're probably capped at 9, maybe 10 activations. It depends if you have Vader or not. And the clone player is equal to that. So if you're playing breakthrough, you've got all these fragile speeder bikes that are viable to get shot down by the arcs, get their free aim when they move. If you're playing something like payload, same thing happens, and the clone player can force a 3x3 skirmish where you're just going to win under weight of numbers. Um, if you're playing bombing run at that stage, especially if you're against Yoda, having free actions to move your own players with Padme's 2-pip with Yoda's guidance actually gives you a number of ways to pick up the bomb and almost play goalie when the speeder bikes come and drop it. So it's still not a terrible matchup. So, Blizzard doesn't exactly do very well there when it's I shouldn't say that. It doesn't do consistently well when they're only playing with 9 activations and may or may not have that force user there. I think if you're trying to play towards something like that, you might actually see some of these stat Geonosian lists coming forward where they have the 12 activations and they can go 3 or 4 times after the clone player has gone, and they just have more mobility and it's not tied to just 3 units.
12 activation stats. What are we in 2022?
There's some pretty nasty Geonosian stat lists that I think you'll see.
And they're units that are more effective than B1s like they were in the list back then.
Yeah, the staps are definitely not the issue when it comes to the high activation triple speeder lists. But if you have a core and potentially even a bounty hunter plus the core plus the staps that can go along with them, there's some real nasty combinations, as I think we'll talk about a little later. But I think you guys hit the nail on the head there. Force them to move and take a bid so that you can play your objectives with your higher acts. One of the other counters that we've seen bandied about against clones and proposed ourselves as well as high velocity spam. Two questions for that. Do we actually see it? And when we do see it, how effective does it actually turn out to be?
You do see it. I question its strength. I feel like oftentimes their dice pools are still too small to effectively stop me from doing what I want to do when I'm playing Yoda and clones. Because eventually I'm going to be able to move into range and eat well.
Yeah, I think especially with the majority of players, even the Anakin players, obviously Yoda players always have barrier because he's got so many slots, and it's dumb not to take it if you can. Like maybe Rebel snipers or Imperial snipers are getting one through. I mean, obviously there's Cassian, but even his, if he's only getting one through, it's getting barriered. I don't know if some of that stuff needs tweaking or if it needs to stay the way it is, so clones aren't just useless. Because otherwise, you just take high velocity everything and they're cooked. But yeah, I mean, the one off or them needing to hit crits is just not exactly something I'm terribly scared of. Because if you get into range where your whole unit can shoot, like say Rebel Commandos, they're losing high velocity once they add another die to that pool. So then dodges are in there, and they have a ton of those. So it's not something I'm terribly worried about. And I do not run barrier, so I might lose a model. That's okay.
Yeah, there's a couple things there. Is when you're talking about high velocity spam, you're generally talking about Galactic Civil War strike teams, and then Iden and Cassian. Both Iden and Cassian are pretty effective against things that are actively good at the moment, like armor spams, like clones. But the rest of the army isn't exactly cut out to do that. Rich, you mentioned that when the gun line closes to 3, they just eat. I mean, it's tough to stay alive when you're talking about 2 wound white save models, even if they have low profile.
Yeah.
You can only hide the snipers for so long, especially when you can't do the peekaboo like you used to. If the leader stays alive and doesn't teleport, it's going to die in 2 shots. And then you start to lose your activation advantage.
Let's be honest, Echo's gonna pop them real quick.
Yeah.
That crit one, they're just one of them's gone this turn and one of them's gone next turn. And actually, you can probably hit them with the other sniper once the first one's gone.
Yeah, you've got enough aims loaded up to get a crit through somehow.
Yeah.
So that makes it tough. And I think another thing is that those lists really aren't effective against the meta. Sniper spam, Galactic Civil War sniper spam is not great against armor. It doesn't have the bodies to chew through Ewoks. It just gets melted by Wookiees. And if it runs into something like Dark Troopers, it can't even damage them unless they get lucky. So while you do see some of that high velocity in the sense of Iden and Cassian, the spam itself isn't super great against things that are good at the moment. So it kind of gets beaten down. And then we haven't even talked about Boyle. If most clone players have some sort of access to force barrier, you then still have Boyle to pull away the pierce to where you want it to. And if you have protector, there's not a whole lot they can do to actually show where the pierce goes.
Yep, that's exactly why that's in my list without barrier, because I can just choose that Boyle's taking that 1 wound you tried to put on my Z6 or my 5s or whatever else I have in my list.
Rich, I think you said Kenobi.
It's one of the reasons why Kenobi is a pretty strong contender to join the meta now, just based off of the fact that he can counter the counter, as it were, and do it pretty effectively. Seeing Kenobi back at LVO reminded me just how good Padme really is, because she enables Anakin, she enables Yoda, she enables Kenobi, she enables all those ARC troopers, and even the ATRT gets a little bit of a benefit from her.
Yeah, I always forget that she can actually share the vehicles with Exemplar.
Yeah,
not that
can
you
we
see
change
it that often, but
can we change the clone ball meta to the Padme meta and just call it what it is? I mean, she's in all of the top lists, right?
she is the common thread. Yeah,
She is the common thread.
Like I want her to be good, but she might be the biggest problem in that faction, for sure.
I think it would help if we had another operative that wasn't R2D2. Just the lack of options in that operative slot makes it so that, oh well, I might as well,
I mean, it's the faction that had the entire Clone Wars going on and did plenty of operative things. I don't know why their only operatives would be Padme and R2, but it's only been 4 years. So I'm sure we'll get one at some point. But this isn't about that. Sorry, guys.
No. All good. All good. Nothing that we said there is false. But yeah, so she definitely helps keep Kenobi going as well. And the high velocity spam is still effective at taking single models or single wounds at a time. But I mean, as soon as you close on round 3, there's not a whole lot they can do to stop it. And it generally doesn't have a lightsaber attached. So once Anakin or Yoda gets into the other army, there's really nothing they can do to stop it. Let's talk about armor, because I think armor has a little bit of a wider range of topics, because there's really one faction that specializes in it, and that's the Empire. And there's a couple different applications. We can talk about Dark Troopers. We can talk about ATSTs and Gav tanks.
Mm.
And when we talk about that, I also would like to just briefly say, I would like to briefly talk about how we actually plan to counter armor, and not just via clones, but just in general. We talked about the counter skirmisher tactics earlier, and I think we could briefly touch on that for armor as well. But Rich, if you're lining up against, an armor list, let's take Dark Troopers, for instance. Like, how are you planning for that?
So with Dark Troopers specifically, they are in a state where they cannot be ignored. They have 2 activations a turn, which means they're gonna do things to your game plan that you cannot anticipate. If I'm playing Yoda, my plan is to get into them as soon as possible. Get as many fire supports with the RPS and the clone squads, uh, probably my ARC troopers as possible, so that I can get over their armor and get some Pierce in there. Because you're gonna need the multiple attacks, and you're gonna need to really uh, defend by being aggressive against them. Is my feeling on them. Uh, the the other armor that you might see, whether it's the ATST or the Gav tank, the old adage has always been you can ignore them and kill all of the things around them, and I think that is still true.
So I'm gonna piggyback on Rich here real quick, if you don't mind. I think it's true to an extent with vehicles, but if you're playing KP, you got to get rid of it because it's just gonna land on you at the end. Probably just maybe stop you from getting to where you need to get to. And I think those are to the point you said when we started this segment of what do you recognize or try to recognize when you walk up to the table and see armor. I think that's if you're playing a certain objective or deployment, you need to realize whether or not you can ignore it because yeah, I mean an AAT I don't care about, but if we're playing an objective where it's going to get my way, I need to get rid of it.
And I think you said as well, Rich, that holds true to an extent until you see a skew. If you see a single Dark Trooper, you can probably ignore it long enough to kill the things around it. If you see a single ATST like you might in an Ewok army, you just kill everything else. And that's fine. If you're rolling 3 to 4 saves a turn from a 200-point unit, so be it. You're pretty happy with that trade-off.
Yeah.
When you talk about Tempest, I think that's another story. I do think you need to kill 1 ATST of the 3. You can still kind of kite 2 ATSTs. You can still survive that like 8 dice a turn because you know that it's only 2 activations that can score. It gets a little hairy when you're rolling, 14 defensive saves a turn from the armor units that can score. So trying to nuke 1 tends to work well in my experience. And if you're running into the other triple armor list that's good, the double dark Gav tank, you have to kill 1 of them.
I think you have to kill 2 there, to be honest with you.
That's fair, because I think there's 7, it's 7 units, 9 activations, correct? I think we're seeing for that.
Yeah, it's such an underrated and nasty list.
It's pretty good.
But
I've
your
only
point,
had
if
to
you get
play
rid of
against
2
it
of them,
twice. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, if you get rid of 2 of them, they have 5 activations. You should be able to outnumber them on whatever the thing is. So yeah, I think getting rid of 2 of those, even if it takes your whole focused fire, even at 8, you probably shouldn't lose 3. So you should be up at worst 6-5. And I think to your point, that's stuff you need to recognize going into a matchup is what can I afford to lose versus what I need to take out, and do that math very quickly as you're setting up and deploying. And don't let the Dark Trooper player get rapid reinforcements.
Don't do that.
There's only one time that's okay, and that's if you're playing a Magna spam. If the Dark Trooper player reinforces close to you and you can get your Magna to range 2 at the start, you're okay with that. Because you've got the impact plus 8 dice with critical and the crit 1. And yeah. It's like the one exception. And maybe if you have Asajj, because you can nuke a Dark Trooper with Asajj.
I do feel like the Dark Knights got pushed out. The Dark Troopers got pushed out by the FD Ahsoka list and Cassian hanging around. But then the Ahsoka, Cassian, FD list kind of got pushed out by the clones. And so like it's in this weird place where like no one's playing these dark troopers because they don't want to get beat by rebels, but the real scary thing that like doesn't want to see dark troopers is the clones, because then they have to drop off an RPS uh for something different, you know.
And let's be honest, I don't think the Ewok list really want to see Dark Troopers either. Not really.
No,
They're
no.
gonna absolutely melt. They're gonna lose. If there's two of them, they're gonna lose 4 activations a turn at that point. So
God.
anybody who's worried about Ewoks is probably bringing Dark Troopers with us.
Yeah, I do think it needs to have the two. Because we've seen some Remnant v Ewok matchups across. I don't know if it was streamed at Golden Sprue, but we've seen it at we've seen it in France, we've seen it in Golden Sprue, we saw one at LVO. If there's only one Dark Trooper, the Ewoks can kind of take advantage of their activations and get into melee with the Death Troopers. And then that takes away a lot of the like higher dice range higher dice pools at range 2. So there probably does need to be the second Dark Trooper to really feel like you have that clear cut advantage against the hordes, whether that's the Wookiees or the Ewoks. But the last point I want to kind of briefly touch on for armor is how much impact do you actually like? How do you plan your impact when it comes to armor when you're building a list? Is there a number you shoot for? Like, do you shoot for I need impact 4 in my army and this is how I achieve it? Or is it more of a like a feeling based on how much critical you have and how much pierce, etc.?
I include my critical as part of my impact. So whenever I'm counting, I want to get to at least 6 is where I try to aim for. Either critical, surge to crit, uh, an impact with some combination of that, so that you know we're with clones especially, because you can fire support into a crit shot from Yoda, a crit shot from Anakin, a crit shot from Padme. You're throwing a lot of dice and you have a lot of aims to hopefully hit a surge or a crit to get through armor if you need to. So generally speaking, not counting Yoda's lightsaber, I'm looking at 4 impact, probably another 2 critical from guns that my guys are using, and then 2 extra surge to crit to be able to handle if I absolutely have to kill some armor.
Got
Yeah, I definitely don't follow the proper rules, I think, for how much impact's in my list. But as a saber throw faithful with Anakin, not to say I'm not scared of armor, but I have an answer for it. I mean, a snow speeder is going down every turn if I see those. If they don't somehow get him off the board first, because he's just gonna chuck a lightsaber and a Z6 is gonna add to it with surge crit. Um, yeah, I mean, to Rich's point, there's options. I have, I think, 2 critical in my list. So while it's something that's kind of more of that's the matchup. If I have to have an uphill battle, I'd rather have it be that one because I still have answers, and I'd rather not add an RPS in place of something that I know is going to give me more dice and can shoot and move.
Yeah, I'm on a similar boat. I do play Anakin with Saber Throw, but I also do have the RPS. I like to have a minimum of 5 impact in any lists that I bring. And I'd like at least if I don't, sorry, if I keep it to 5, I want some of it to have Pierce. If I'm running all impact that has no Pierce backing, like if there is no lightsaber, I do think you need to lean more towards like 6 or 7, like Rich was talking about, just to make sure that you do have a little bit of protection for the save variants. Because every now and then an ATST will save. I mean,
It
the white
happens.
surging save is only 1 paint face less than the red dice, and sometimes it just spikes. And then you're like, oh, I'm fucked. Because the
Yep.
ATST saves 5 out of 6. And you're like, oh, there's half my turn gone.
One of the things that we didn't bring up in our counter meta is Shadow Collective. I also think that Shadow Collective has a lot of tools in the box to be more surprising than most players are used to playing. If you don't play against a lot of Shadow Collective, uh, they'll do things that you're really scratching your head about on many different turns. Whether it's Kentucky Dan's Cash Me If You Can list, or uh, I was playing triple bikes with the bus and Maul, um, from Izzy Bodicus, uh, which was just it's able to maneuver fast, and it's able to get in quick and do the melee skew thing, but also able to do the speeder skew thing, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's got a lot of like skewy tactics, Shadow Collective. I mean, you can have that ultra defensive line with the pikes and Bosk, and everyone's got 16 dodges by the time that you shoot them. You can do the bikes and maul, the swoops and maul, where you can get into your opponent's face on turn one and you're pressuring their weak flanks turn two. It can just roll you over with dice at Black Sun Collective if you're running something like Maul Bus and 6 Black Suns. Like, these are all archetypes that we've seen do very well at tournaments. If you have the answer to them off the get-go, they tend to fall apart. But if you don't have the clear-cut counter for what Shadow Collective is trying to do, it is a miserable time to face. And oftentimes clones don't have that clear-cut answer. They just have to try to weight of dice and saves.
Hope that the dice are going to do enough to pull it through, and sometimes they don't. And like that is one of the things that I think is very true about the meta right now, is that clones look like an unbeatable, unstoppable force, right up until they don't. And like, every clone player that has played clones for a long time will tell you, you'll hit a board and all of a sudden this crazy out of the nowhere list that you never could have anticipated has done things in a fashion that you couldn't quite handle with enough force all at once.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, like if you even go back to our game at Sprue, I think we both had fairly fair dice throughout the most of the game. But that first big shot I had on you, if you have slightly below or even more than that below average on that first defense roll, like that's probably game because you lost one unit. And
Yeah,
it's a terrifying feeling when your army's like, all right, well, if I have one bad roll, that's it. Like I know that can be for a lot of people, but when you're running expensive 8 activations, I mean, make the clone player roll dice. Like,
Yeah.
that's your best way of winning. I don't think you should rely on dice variance, but if you can get them to a point where at average rolls, they might be feeling a little scared or nervous because it's every roll is, I don't want to say terrifying because that's super exaggerating, but like every roll is way too pricey for a clone player, especially one that doesn't have all the defensive tech.
If you pick up 4 dice, 4 defense dice as a clone player, you're clenching.
Yep. Just
Yeah.
like, oh,
Yeah, I mean,
well, here goes the whole squad.
Even if you have the surges, like it's a tiny sample size, it's going to fail at some point. And if you've burnt your dodges and you're still rolling 4 dice, you feel really bad about it. And just make the clone player do that as often as possible.
Yeah, big dice pools and picking the time to attack. Don't just jump out there and start trying to throw dice. Make sure your attacks are well timed and you optimize that time when they don't have as many tokens. Set it up at the beginning of the round. Know that certain shots you might have to sacrifice a unit and their hit is going to need to hit, but that might be the play you need to make. You need to just stick something, weaken them, and I mean, like Rich said, it falls over real quick. It's a rough avalanche when you start losing a couple models because they just disappear.
8 acts is not a lot, and mass activation or as I call the Wookiees, thick activations are really upsetting. They can get in there and all of a sudden, your whole plan of, oh well, Yoda's going to do a standby and do this really cool, force push into getting their shot off. Now you have to do that to 2 to 3 different units because they all got into melee, and cool, you're in trouble. So getting in there when you need to, if that's your list, being mobile if that's your list, or making sure that your shots count if you're doing the ranged gun line thing.
So let's wrap up our world's talk here with like 2 dark horse lists that we think might work. And when I say a dark horse list, what I mean is that something that's not considered traditional meta, that you think can make the deep run at Worlds, something that can go that 8-0 and win it all. Would anybody like to go first?
I have a what if.
Sure, let's hit it.
I think if scale didn't change, Grievous and Geos would be absolutely terrifying because he could just get in there, move as quick as he can around the table, and he doesn't care about these Inquisitors saying you can't force push me because he can't do it anyway. They can support him by just following him up with their moves, and the tables are dense now. I think at Grievous's height, tables were a little more open across the average Legion area, except for Nick's amazing tables, which have always been great. But yeah, I think he would be. I think he could do some stuff, especially scale and relentless. Like he could just be poking with them, and then to your point, most of these lists don't have anything for when Anakin and Yoda get in. I don't think he's the answer, but he's going to slow them down a lot, especially surging to crit against them.
So do you think something like if you just put Maul in the place of Grievous here could work instead?
I think because if I'm not mistaken, Grievous has block.
Yes.
The keyword that two people in the game have. I guess all of the non-Republic Jedi now have, or no, I guess they don't. They only have it. Sorry, they have deflect. But yeah, I think the deflect nerf really still hampers them because if he dives into arcs, they're just gonna kick him to death, and then fire support. But like if you lose your 150 point Grievous and he killed some stuff, you're probably okay with that.
I am going to say Maul in some super commandos. I think that it is an underutilized combo for the Shadow Collective, where they're currently, they do the mobile thing, they do the I have a force push thing that you're probably looking for. And if they have the bikes, if it's the bike version with the super commandos, then you have a lot of fast moving flanking attackers that you can make some hay with.
I think my dark horse pick is kind of a cop out, but I'm going to say Bosk. I think Bosk fits a lot of different list archetypes at the moment, and I would not be surprised in the slightest if you see him make a deep run. You can fit Bosk and Maul together. You can fit Bosk with Geonosians. You can run a pretty nasty Bosk Seventh Sister list if you want to go to Empire and try a gun line that way. He fits into a lot of different archetypes, and he does a lot of very effective things with suppressive against the Geonosians, surge crit against the clones if they don't have SA, range 4 poking if you're trying to kite something. He's got that surge crit pierce for armor. Like, he does a lot. So I think if there's something that flies under the radar that does well at Adepticon, it'll be Bosk. But let's
Yeah, I was hoping you.
Good.
I was hoping you forgot to say surge crit against armor because that was what I was going to contribute to this segment. Was yeah, like it's not the ideal thing to be shooting at, but if it's something you need to get rid of in that matchup, like surge crit can shoot twice. He's got that one turn where he's guaranteed 5 crits, pierce 1.
Yeah, I mean you're taking out half of literally any armor vehicle when you have flying and weight. 5 pierce 1 is going to do a lot of damage to a tank.
Hopefully,
especially if it's white save, it's probably doing 4 or 5.
But let's wrap up with a little best worst then. Kind of do a nice tidy bow. And we're going to do a little twist this week because I feel like we've kind of exhausted all the good categories. I'm not going to lie. We've hit our special forces, we've hit vehicles, and we've hit non-force users. I think people have kind of beat to death force users lately when it comes to ranking them in tiers. We've talked to that one ad nauseum. We've lamented the status of operatives in GAR. We've praised the flexibility of bounty hunters. Let's do keywords. And that's like any kind of unit ability keyword. So like, what do we think is the best keyword in Legion? And what do we think is the worst?
Plotting.
Okay.
It's the worst. It's the worst. They fixed cumbersome so that it's actually useful now because you can shoot first and then move. But plotting is the most devastating keyword. It's very necessary for the Dark Troopers, but it doesn't feel great on your eWeb for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's so bad it was literally taken out of the game before it was brought back as a hamper, as a con for taking a unit.
Yeah.
Pat, what do you think the worst keyword is?
Just the worst?
Yeah, let's start with the worst.
Are we talking gameplay experience or like the worst actual keyword?
However you want to phrase it.
Because I think the dumbest one is low profile. I think cover should stop at 2. The Ewoks would probably need some tweaking then, but I just think canceling 3 before dodges is a little
I love
it's
it.
a little much.
I love it. I love it so much.
Oh man. But I guess you could also argue that Exemplar fits that same mold if we're talking gameplay experience.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
Man,
It's very
I guess
difficult to
deflect.
have a fun time against it.
Deflect is the worst keyword.
It is. It's terrible. It's a terrible keyword.
Because as it's written, I mean, as much as I started that as a joke, it on top of the choke changes, killed Dooku, killed Maul. You know, I haven't seen a Ventress since she came out because of the changes. I think I saw a couple, and it's a shame because they're awesome units that people want to play, and I don't see the harm in them somehow using their lightsaber to block punches in melee. It seems pretty fair for 150 to 220 point unit.
For sure.
Yeah, if we've got one that's so bad it was taken out of the game and a few that are, terrible NP, I guess I'll go for like worst gameplay. I think expert climber is the worst keyword in the game, other than plotting. Like it doesn't height 2 terrain
Scale?
is so
Scale?
at least scale gives you
Oh.
unhindered. And that's
Okay.
the only saving grace I can think of off the top of my head. Expert
forgot
climber
it did
doesn't even
that.
give you that. It's like literally part of scale. But I think like climbing down from height 2 just so very rarely happens and is ever even possible. It's very difficult to transport and just travel with height 2 terrain, let alone have things that you're climbing on top of or giving good gameplay reasons. So it's just a keyword that people are paying for that you don't even need. And when's the last time you saw a grappling hook?
Never.
I was gonna say that's an
2018.
expensive. It's 2 points for something you're never gonna use.
Yeah. But Rich, what do you think the best keyword is? Because I think there's a lot of really, really good contenders here.
It's got to be exemplar for me. Exemplar is a keyword that every support commander, from Leia to Veers to Krennic, would love to have. The ability to share tokens from the get-go is very powerful. And it's either exemplar or independent for me, but I think I give it to exemplar.
I mean, we joked earlier that it's the Padme meta, and that's why. It's that keyword. Pat, what do you think?
I'm gonna be a homer here. There's so many good ones to choose from. I'm gonna pick one that a lot of people probably don't like, and it's gonna be fire support. It gives you, I guess mostly as a clone player, gives you an option to just absolutely deal with something that you do not feel like dealing with. You're just like, all right, as long as this goes as it should, that thing's gone. Or at least, like we said, it helps with the armor. I mean, you're chucking 3 red plus whatever units add into Anakin. Surge crit probably. Impact 3.
It's
Yeah,
always
I mean,
fun to pick up a bowl of dice and just throw them at the table. It just feels good. It just feels good, even when it rolls bad.
Ironically enough, since I did just say I haven't seen one on the table in a while, the last time I played Nasaj, I started a round off where she had to roll 15 red defense dice to see if she lived, and I mean, even at average, you're not surviving that. So, yeah, I'm gonna go with fire support.
I'm gonna go with unstoppable. I think that it is a keyword that literally gives you another activation is disgustingly good, and it's only kept in check by the fact that it's on a 200 point unit right now.
Mace Windu win.
Right. If you ever saw like a 160 point unstoppable unit, if the unit itself is even halfway proficient, that keyword would make it the unit to play because you're getting 2 for 1 for free. And
So
the
you're
Dark
saying
Troopers
Empire
obviously.
will get that next.
What's up?
More of it. Empire will get more of that next, is what you're saying.
I think there's a couple of things that Empire could get that have unstoppable, like thematically, that would be cool. I hope it's a keyword that we never see more of except for Mace Windu, because it just seems to fit him so well. But I think that's the strongest one in the game. It's just kept down by the fact that you're on a 200 point unit and it's a 200 point unit that has plotting. the keyword is so good, they literally had to bring back one that we cut from the game to make it viable.
So, and this is a question maybe we'll answer next time we meet up. But do you think that the last round of nerfs that Dark Troopers took, that Blizzard took, in the wake of the meta that we've seen develop, were necessary, or could they have been toned down a little?
I think the nerfs to the units themselves were fine. I think it is an unintentional side effect that other gameplay rule changes that happened at the same time positively impacted the things that were already halfway decent against the units that got nerfed, like choke, like deflect. Taking away the potency of choke and deflect artificially boosted the stock. Well, actually, tangibly boosted the stock of the units that it was good against, aka clones, fire support, heavy impact, that then doubled down the pain that the nerfs inflicted to Blizzard and Dark Troopers. I think the nerfs are fine. I think the nerfs in combination with the buffs that other units received are not okay.
And it's kind of like what we saw with the clones when Rex first got hit. It was too many things at once that affected not just him, but clones in general. And seems like you were hinting at Vader pretty heavily there. But yeah, I mean, he got crushed because he got hit by this list got more expensive, or you can't take this, and then choke's not as good. Like Vader's still scary, but the fact that he can't pick up my Z6 out of his choice, I think the rule change wasn't great, but I'm not mad about it as a player of the unit that doesn't want to get picked up off the table.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna enjoy it while it's like this. That's fine.
Same.
And then before we run, just want to do our usual plug. Thank you guys for joining us as always. It's always a pleasure to chat. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. If you're interested at all, check out the Fifth Trooper Patreon. I forget this at the start of every single episode, so I'm sure Jay will remind me again. But check us out on Patreon. You can join our Discord. You can come hang out with us. We do play games. We chat with the group and such. So feel free to join us there. And then if you're local to the area here, we do have a couple tournaments coming up that have been recently announced. There is a tournament on March 2nd at Top Deck Games in New Jersey. It's going to be a warm-up tournament for Worlds. There is no player cap. The player cap is as many tables as Nick can supply, so it's capped at 64. So don't be afraid to sign up. You will be able to play. And Inquisitors will be legal. So if you have an Inquisitor proxy, just send it to Nick and you'll be able to proxy it for that event. It's intended for an Adepticon warm-up, so we're going to try to play with everything that's available for Adepticon. And then on Saturday, April 27th, I know this is a little bit further out, but there's going to be a tournament, the Keystone Classic 2 in Wilkes-Barre. Last year it was hosted at a hotel just outside of the Scranton Wilkes-Barre area. It was really nice. We had our own little ballroom for it. So they're going to be putting that one on again, and signups for the game uplink are available there if you search for Keystone Classic 2 on the website. But I hope you guys have a wonderful day. We'll chat with you in a couple weeks, and stay warm, stay safe this winter.